Hello everyone, today we will step into the ancient Persian court, where justice wore a mask and mercy was not always welcome. Picture a grand chamber, where whispers carry heavier weight than verdicts, and a man in rich robes, seated high above the crowd, renders decisions not with conscience but with coin. This is the beginning of Judge Sisamnes' descent, a man who thought power made him untouchable. But in the eyes of a king who would not be mocked, betrayal came with a price paid in flesh. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have judged him as harshly? The court of Cambyses II, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, glittered with gold and grandeur. Tall columns stretched to heaven, and sunlight filtered through high windows as if weighed down by the seriousness of law. It was a place where the fate of entire cities could be changed by the flick of a finger. And seated at the center of that judgment, cloaked in robes of crimson and authority, sat Judge Sisamnes. To the people, he was law incarnate. His words carried the power of gods and kings alike. But behind the solemn mask of wisdom lay a different man, one whose loyalty swayed with silver, whose gaze softened not at the sight of truth but at the glint of bribes. He had once been a model servant of justice. Appointed by Cambyses himself, Sisamnes was known for his stern rulings, often swift, often feared. But the longer he held the seat of judgment, the more the seat began to change him. Wealth poured in quietly, in locked boxes, in whispered exchanges. A merchant offered gold to dismiss an accusation of theft. A noble promised favors for a favorable ruling in a land dispute. And Sisamnes, unseen by most, accepted it all, each coin a silent betrayal. The corruption grew slowly, like roots beneath a palace. And in the beginning, it was easy to hide. Sisamnes masked his greed behind lengthy deliberations and carefully worded decisions. To most, he remained a beacon of law. But a system that permits rot never stays upright for long. Whispers eventually reached the ears they were never meant to. King Cambyses, known not only for his power but for his obsession with order, heard the rumors. And unlike many monarchs who might overlook such behavior for convenience, Cambyses did not blink. To him, a corrupted judge was a worse traitor than a foreign enemy. An outside foe attacked with sword and fire, but an unjust judge attacked the very soul of the kingdom. So Cambyses did not confront Sisamnes immediately. He watched. He tested. One day, under a false name, a royal agent appeared before the judge with a petty dispute, one involving land rights and grain storage. The case was inconsequential to the empire, but the agent brought a pouch of coins and a hidden offer. Sisamnes accepted without hesitation. That was all the king needed. Justice, he decided, would not come quietly. The betrayal had been public, and so too would be its reckoning. But this would not be an execution in the shadows. Cambyses, furious, wanted a message, a warning etched into the minds of every official, every judge, every citizen who believed justice could be bought. Sisamnes had no idea that his final days were already numbered, that each time he sat upon the bench, he was merely digging deeper into his own grave. On the surface, all was as it had been. He continued to rule, continued to accept gold under the table. But the palace around him grew colder. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations hushed when he approached. Then, one morning, the guards arrived, not with a summons, but with iron restraints. The court was full when it happened. No warning, no formal accusation. Just the booming voice of the king's herald. Sisamnes, judge of Persia, is hereby charged with treason against justice. There was no protest. Sisamnes knew. Perhaps he had known all along that this day would come. But nothing could have prepared him for what Cambyses had in mind. The penalty would not simply be death. It would be a story retold, a lesson engraved not in scrolls, but in skin. And so, the judge who once wore crimson was led away, not to a prison, but to a stage. one built in haste, in the very center of the court he once ruled. It stood tall and surrounded by spectators, nobles, merchants, soldiers, commoners, all summoned to witness what happens when the scales of justice are tipped. There would be no trial, no defense. Cambyses had decided. The verdict had been sealed the moment Sisamnes took his first bribe. And the punishment would be spoken not in words but in the screams of a man stripped of all title, dignity, and finally flesh. The wooden platform groaned underfoot as Sisamnes was dragged forward, bound and trembling. The air hung heavy with silence, thick, breathless, expectant. A crowd had gathered in the courtyard of the royal palace, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. They had come expecting punishment, but few could imagine the method about to unfold. King Cambyses appeared on the balcony above, robed in black, flanked by guards who looked more like executioners than protectors. He did not speak long. His voice, calm and controlled, echoed through the stone corridors. "Sisamnes, you were entrusted with justice," he declared. "Instead, you turned it into a marketplace. You sold righteousness for silver. And now your skin shall remind the empire what justice truly costs." The crowd did not cheer. They simply stared. This was no ordinary sentencing. And Sisamnes, who once silenced courtrooms with a gesture, was now stripped of all control. Executioners approached with solemn precision. They were dressed in ceremonial black and carried not swords or axes, but knives, long, thin, curved. Their tools were not designed for quickness. They were designed for messages. Sisamnes was strapped to a wide bench carved of dark cedar. His arms stretched taut, his legs bound to iron rings driven into the wood. The scent of oil and steel wafted through the air. Torches flickered in the corners, and the platform felt more like an altar than a place of punishment. No words were exchanged between executioners. They had done this before. The first incision was silent. Sisamnes did not scream, not immediately. But his body flinched violently, and a low moan escaped his throat. The knife had pierced the flesh of his arm, just below the shoulder, slicing along the length with chilling precision. The executioner's hand moved methodically, drawing back the skin like peeling parchment from a scroll. That was when the crowd began to understand. This was not death. Not yet. This was flaying. And Cambyses would not allow it to end quickly. Each stroke of the blade pulled more flesh away from muscle. The skin, once a barrier of dignity, was transformed into a spectacle, held up to the gasps of nobles who had once knelt before the same man now mutilated. The executioners worked in a rhythm, left arm, right arm, back, chest. Sisamnes screamed now, hoarse and broken, but the blades did not pause. Nor did the king. The spectators could not look away. They were witnessing more than punishment. They were watching a warning unfold in real time, etched not in law, but in agony. Cambyses, watching from above, remained unmoved. To him, justice was not only about the law, it was about fear. He knew that pain engraved deeper than parchment. That memory, when soaked in horror, lasts generations. And so he ensured this memory would never fade. Sisamnes' face had gone pale, his eyes rolling back as the executioners reached his lower limbs. But Cambyses ordered that he remain alive for as long as the body allowed. Herbal tonics were poured into his mouth, not to ease suffering, but to prolong it. The king wanted every inch of skin removed while the judge still breathed. The knives moved down his legs, along the ankles, and around the ribs. They carved methodically, not in haste. The executioners were artisans of pain, trained to extract life slowly, deliberately. With every sliver removed, a deeper lesson was taught. This was what became of men who betrayed the throne, not with swords, but with silence sold to the highest bidder. And the skin, soaked in blood, was not discarded. It was gathered. Each strip was carefully laid out on silk cloths, labeled and preserved. The king had ordered it personally. For Cambyses did not intend to bury the crime or the criminal. He intended to display it. By the time the final piece was removed, Sisamnes no longer screamed. His mouth hung open, but no sound emerged. His body trembled in shock, but he still lived. Barely. And yet Cambyses was not done. He gestured to his guards. A throne-like chair was brought forward, ornate, carved of dark wood, and studded with iron nails. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that made it legendary. It was the upholstery. The strips of Sisamnes skin were to be tanned and stitched, transformed into the very seat where the next judge would sit. A throne made of justice corrupted and reclaimed. The king's voice rang out again. Let no man forget what happens to those who betray their duty. Let every judge feel justice on their back before they speak it with their mouth. It was not merely vengeance. It was legacy. Sisamnes died not long after, his body reduced to muscle, his name to a whisper. But Cambyses made certain he would be remembered. Not as a man of law. Not as a noble. But as a judge whose skin became a lesson sharper than any sword. And in that courtyard, as the blood was washed from the stones and the crowd slowly dispersed, a new understanding settled over the empire. Justice, they now knew, was not a suggestion. It was a demand. The skin of Sisamnes was no longer flesh. It had been transformed, tanned, cured, treated with spices and resin. No part was wasted. Under Cambyses' decree, the artisans had been instructed not to craft a tapestry or hide it in a vault, but to create something far more intimate, far more sinister. The chair. When it was unveiled in the Hall of Judgments, the reaction was silence. Not the respectful hush of reverence, but a silence steeped in unease. The chair looked regal, dark wood carved with the faces of lions and blindfolded justices, the arms curled like serpents, the legs shaped like roots clawing into the marble floor. But what caught the eye was the seat. The skin, Sisamnes' skin, was stretched across the backrest, armrests, and cushion. It had been dyed in muted tones to preserve its surface. If you didn't know, you might think it was leather. But they knew. Everyone knew. It wasn't just a chair. It was a shrine of consequence. A warning that whispered even louder than the king's voice. Because once you sat upon it, you could never forget what you were sitting on. The next judge appointed was Otanes, Sisamnes' own son. Cambyses had chosen him not out of mercy, but strategy. The message would be clearest if it came through blood. When Otanes was summoned to court and presented with his father's chair, he did not speak. He did not cry. He simply looked at it, and sat. His spine straightened. His breath shallowed. The weight beneath him was more than physical. For years, Otanes would render judgment from that chair. He never smiled. He never hesitated. When bribers came to test him, he had them executed without delay. When nobles tried to sway him with gifts, he refused before they finished speaking. When verdicts came with consequences, he delivered them with precision. He never dared betray the robe, or the skin, he sat upon. And yet, behind closed doors, Otanes spoke little. He was said to have nightmares, whispering his father's name in the dark. Servants heard him weep at night, alone in his quarters, always kneeling before a small altar, an offering of silver scales cracked down the middle. A symbol, perhaps, of how justice had broken his family, and stitched itself back together with horror. Over time, the chair became legend. Children were taught of it not in classrooms but in stories whispered after dark, the judge who betrayed his office, and whose flesh became a throne. Artists painted it in hushed tones, never quite daring to capture its true horror. Even in neighboring kingdoms, the tale traveled, taking root in places where judges ruled without conscience. And the name Sisamnes? It lived on, but not as a hero, not even as a villain. He became a ghost, a skin without a voice. And Cambyses, for all his cruelty, had succeeded in his design. Justice across the empire grew harsher, yes, but also fairer. Judges now looked twice before handing out verdicts. Bribes became rarer. Fear had done what faith could not. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Some questioned the righteousness of a system built on terror. Could law truly be justice, they asked, if it required a throne of flesh to keep it upright? Others feared what would happen when the memory of Sisamnes faded. Would they flay again? Would every betrayal need new skin? Cambyses never answered. He had already moved on, building monuments, launching campaigns, and stamping his authority across distant provinces. But in his most private chamber stood a small replica of the chair, crafted from wood and polished bone, too small to sit on, too sharp to forget. He kept it behind glass, and each morning, before court, he would gaze at it for a long moment. Perhaps it reminded him of power. Or perhaps, in the quiet moments before verdicts were signed and generals dispatched, it reminded him of cost. As for Otanes, he grew old upon that throne. His back bent with time, his eyes dimmed, but he never once left that seat during a hearing. He died with his hands resting on its arms, lips sealed, spine stiff. Some say his final breath whispered, "I have paid." And after his death, the chair remained. No one dared destroy it. No one even dared move it. It was left in the Hall of Judgments, roped off but untouched. A silent sentinel in a court where law had grown colder, sharper, cleaner. But every now and then, when new judges walked past it, young, proud, brimming with ambition, they would pause. Their eyes would linger. Their fingers would twitch. And then, slowly, they would bow. Not to the king. Not to the law. But to the chair. Because some stories are carved in stone. Others are carved in memory. And a few, like Sisamnes, are carved into the very skin of justice itself. The chair stood still, but the world around it began to shift. Empires rise not only on laws and conquests, but on whispers, and the tale of Sisamnes, stretched taut and silent over that judicial throne, continued to echo beyond the polished marble of Cambyses' courts. Years passed. Cambyses himself grew more tyrannical, unhinged by power and isolation. He crushed rebellions with ease but ruled increasingly from paranoia. When a trusted advisor dared to question a minor verdict, Cambyses did not respond with words. Instead, he pointed to the chair. "Would you prefer that seat?" he asked, his voice cold as stone. The advisor resigned the next day. By then, the chair had become more than legend, it was doctrine. No code of law referenced it, yet every magistrate knew its weight. Justice, once a noble ideal, had become a cautionary tale. In training halls for scribes and junior judges, the instructors would not teach from scrolls on day one. They would walk their students in silence through the Hall of Judgments, stop before the throne of skin, and let them stare. Some looked away. Some looked too long. But all remembered. Eventually, Cambyses died, some say poisoned by his own brother, others claim he fell on his own sword during a fit of madness. His death marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. The empire did not collapse, but it cracked. Regional rulers, no longer under his shadow, began testing boundaries. One by one, they moved away from his brand of justice, viewing it as too extreme, too theatrical. The chair, however, could not be undone. It was too powerful a symbol, too deeply etched into the soul of the law. So they kept it, but repurposed it. No longer used in daily proceedings, it was moved behind glass, elevated on a dais in a vault lit by a single oil lamp. It was renamed the Judgment Seat, as if giving it a cleaner title might cleanse the memory. But even behind the glass, it had power. A new ruler arose, a man named Darius, more moderate, more calculating. He abolished the worst excesses of Cambyses' reign, yet he too paid private visits to the chair. When tensions flared in provinces far from the capital, he had it moved briefly, on a velvet-lined cart, to the steps of the outer court, allowing it to be seen, not touched. The effect was immediate. Discontent faded. Order returned. The threat didn't need repeating. All it took was the presence of memory. But for those who worked closest to the relic, the story began to sour in subtler ways. The man tasked with cleaning the chamber found himself losing sleep. He claimed to see the fabric ripple when no wind touched it. He began talking to the chair, whispering apologies under his breath. One morning, he was found dead in his quarters, a piece of parchment clenched in his hand. It read, "I judged none, and yet it judged me." Others began reporting strange occurrences. Court clerks heard soft rustling in the chamber, like footsteps or breath. One magistrate claimed that when he passed by the glass, he saw not the stitched skin of Sisamnes, but his own face reflected back, mouth sealed shut. Even the wood began to change. Craftsmen inspecting the chair for signs of decay found that it remained perfectly preserved, but only the wood. The skin, though untouched by mold or moth, felt different. It was no longer just cured hide. It had taken on a texture described as tense, as though it held breath. And beneath it, hidden deep within the armrest, was a message, not carved by tool, but stained in blood, faded and hard to read. 3 words. He watches still. Speculation grew. Some believed Sisamnes' spirit lingered, trapped within the very skin that once bound him in flesh. Others whispered that the chair was not merely a warning, it was a portal, a tether anchoring the soul of justice in a world too frail to carry its weight. But the high priests of law, unwilling to indulge in superstition, dismissed the talk. "It is an artifact," they declared. "A relic of discipline." And yet, no judge ever sat in it again. Not even once. In time, rulers came and went. Laws were rewritten. Temples rose, then fell. But the chair remained, untouched, unmoved. Its chamber was sealed behind double doors, and only once a year was it opened, during a ceremony where new judges swore oaths before it. But there was one moment, one year, where the ritual changed. The doors were opened. The chair was gone. Panic seized the court. Guards were interrogated. No trace of theft, no broken locks, no missing keys. Just absence. 3 days later, it returned. No one knew how. It stood in the center of the chamber again, same position, same oil lamp above. But now, there was something new. Upon the seat, resting lightly, like a gift, was a single white feather. And on the wall behind it, scrawled in a trembling hand, "If justice forgets, I will remember." There are objects that bear witness, and then there are those that judge. The chair made of Sisamnes' skin was never simply furniture. It had grown into something else. Not sentient, not alive in the way we understand, but charged, like a blade left in a storm, humming with the memory of lightning. Years turned to centuries. The story of the flayed judge faded into myth. In time, the name Sisamnes was dropped from legal texts, deemed too disturbing for the modern mind. But it survived in darker corners, scratched into the stone behind courthouses, whispered by archivists too long buried in dust. And always the chair remained. It was moved once more, far from public view. Beneath the main palace, deep within a cold subchamber lined with iron doors, it sat in silence. No longer lit by an oil lamp, now watched by flickering fluorescent light. Dust gathered. Cameras blinked. No one visited. Until one day they did. A young historian named Corin, fresh from the university, requested permission to study artifacts of imperial law. He was idealistic, hungry to uncover truth where others only feared shadows. The chair was listed as item number 43 in a forgotten archive. He descended alone. The security officer warned him to take no photographs. Just notes. Corin had nodded, notebook in hand. When he reached the chamber, it was colder than he expected. Not from lack of heat, something else. As though the air itself resisted warmth. There it was, the judgment seat. Time had not claimed it. The wood was dark and oiled. The stitched hide was dull, but intact. It looked like a throne waiting for a verdict. Corin circled it slowly, sketching. He traced the seams in ink, noted the strange preservation of the skin. Then, something struck him, an odd swelling beneath the armrest, as if something was trapped beneath the layer. He reached out and touched it. The room shivered. Not literally, but Corin would later swear the floor swayed, like a ship on black water. The fluorescent light above flickered, not a mechanical stutter, but a pulse. And in that 1/2 second Corin said he heard a voice. Not aloud. Inside. You sit. You carry. You answer. He jerked his hand back. But his fingertips were stained, not red, but a gray-black, like ink turned to ash. He rubbed them clean on his sleeve. It left no mark. He looked again. The bump was gone. He checked his notebook. The sketches were smudged, warped. One page had rewritten itself. The straight lines of his handwriting now slanted sharply, and a phrase had appeared in the margin. Justice is the skin we shed last. Corin ran. He never returned to the archives. His thesis was quietly withdrawn. When asked why, he replied only, Some truths are cages. But stories travel, even when sealed. A decade later, a different visitor came, not a scholar, but a judge. Senior, respected, with decades of service. He asked no questions. He went alone. When he exited the chamber, he was pale. He retired early that year. Said he had seen enough. Others followed. A slow trickle. Not of pilgrims, but of penitents, men and women in power who had reached their limits, desperate for something pure. They left changed. They spoke less. Some resigned. One vanished. Eventually, the state intervened. The chamber was sealed. The chair, though too potent to destroy, was entombed in a vault of lead and stone. It was declared archaeological material of unresolved provenance. In public, it was denied. In private, it was feared. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, one of the guards would swear they heard footsteps behind the door. Not the shuffling of mice, nor the hum of ancient ventilation. Bootsteps. Deliberate. Waiting. And once, just once, a technician repairing the surveillance system in the basement caught an image on the monitor. It was a single frame, distorted by static. But unmistakable. A man sat in the chair. He wore robes of an older age. His face was lost in shadow. But his hands were bound by threads of ink, bleeding down the arms of the seat like veins. And in his mouth, there was no tongue. Only silence. A still image. Frozen. Then gone. They shut down the system the next day. The camera was removed. The wires sealed. And a new sign placed on the chamber door. It bore no words, just a mark burned into wood. A hand? Palm down. 5 fingers outstretched. The symbol of a verdict passed. In time, new empires rose. New rulers judged. But deep beneath it all, in that vault of echoes and skin, the truth waited. Because in the end, justice is not mercy. It remembers. It waits. It wears the faces of the guilty and the innocent alike. And when all courts fail, when laws twist, and rulers rot, it returns in silence, wearing the last skin of the first man who forgot.